Hey, hi, hello. My name is Lydia. Welcome to my channel. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. If you are interested in true crime like I am, I hope you stick around. A special hello to my returning subscribers. I am so happy to have you here. Today is actually my birthday, my fellow true crime enthusiasts, and I am happy to be recording this video on my birthday. It's one of my favorite things to do. I'd like to thank my viewer, Allie Babe, for requesting this case from Australia. Allie lived in the area where this crime occurred, and she was friends with one of the close family members. She recalled that it was one of the worst things to ever happen in her city at the time. Thank you so much, Allie, for recommending this case. And speaking of Australia and my viewers from that country, happy spring. This is the story of one family who suffered through not only one horrible murder, but 6. And the tragic part is that 4 of those murders should have been prevented from happening. This is the story of one of Australia's worst killers at the time, Alan Douglas Thompson. In early 1984, a young family lived a peaceful existence in Richardson, an area outside of Canberra, the national capital of Australia and the territorial capital of ACT, otherwise known as the Australian Capital Territory. I'm showing maps on the screen now of where exactly this area is within Australia. The ACT is federal territory located in southeastern Australian mainland as an enclave completely within the state of New South Wales. Today, Canberra is Australia's largest inland city and the 8th largest city in the country overall. However, as Allie described it when she recommended this case to me, Canberra was like a big country town during the time period in which these murders took place in the early 1980s. The young family living in Richardson included Radmilla, or Rad as she liked to be called. Rad's maiden name was Milosevic, and she was 21 years old at the time. Rad came from a large family, and I'll get back to that point later in the story. Rad's de facto husband, or otherwise known as a common-law husband, was Tony Baker, and Tony was 22 years old in 1984. The couple's 2 young children rounded out the family, with Danny, age 4, and Lisa, age 2. And from the photos on screen, you will see that they look like a happy, loving family. The children were blonde and adorable, and Rad was thin and beautiful with long brown hair, and Tony was handsome with a great smile. The family of 4 kept in regular contact with friends and family, and Tony was a very reliable worker. So when Tony didn't show up to work for a couple days, the extended family was contacted to see if anything was wrong at the house. On March 31st, 1984, at around 9:30 p.m., Rad's sister, Dara, and Dara's boyfriend arrived at the house looking for Tony and for Rad. Dara and Rad were close, and she hadn't been able to reach her by telephone. When Dara and her boyfriend arrived, they saw the family's car in the driveway, but when they knocked on the door, pounded on it, calling out the family's names, no one came, no one answered. The house itself was locked up tight. No doors were open, no windows left open, nothing looked wrong. No windows had been smashed, no doorknobs had been knocked off, everything was locked up. Eventually, Dara went around the house peering in the windows. She was able to look in the kitchen window, and she saw that a couple of the burners on the stovetop were turned on. It was an electric stovetop, and the burners were glowing red. She also noticed that some newspapers had been stuffed around the stovetop as well. Very concerned about what she was seeing, Dara wanted to break in the house, but her boyfriend told her to wait for the police instead. So when the police were called and the responding officer came out, he saw the hazard of the stovetop through the window, so he decided to smash in a window and enter the house. He entered the home calling out for the Young family. Immediately, the officer knew that something was very wrong. Not only did he smell a strong odor of gasoline, he noticed an empty jug of gasoline as well. Gasoline had been poured on the walls, on the carpet, on the furniture. It was everywhere. In the kitchen, newspaper had been stuffed around the front burners of the stove, but whomever had turned the burners on had failed to turn on the front burners to full heat. Therefore, the newspaper had not ignited. In fact, only the two back burners had been turned to full heat and were glowing red. To the officer, it was clear that there had been an attempt to set a fire, but it had failed. The next question was, who had attempted to set the fire? Was it someone from the Young family? Had it been Rad? Had it been Tony? And where were they? In the main living areas, there was no sign of anyone being home. And there was no sign of a struggle. No lamps had been knocked over, and all the furniture was still in the right place. However, as the police officer looked further, he noticed blankets on the floor of the living room, and as he peeked underneath, he noticed blood stains. There were large areas of blood, and it looked like someone had tried to clean the blood from the carpet. Whoever had attempted the cleanup had taken cleaning solution from the kitchen and tried to rub out the blood stain from the carpet. And apparently, when that effort was unsuccessful, they just tossed a blanket on top. Of course, the blood on the floor meant that something horrible indeed had happened in the house. And the officer was left to investigate the rest of the home to see if it was indeed empty and no one was home, or if someone was lying somewhere, injured and bleeding, or possibly worse. Following a trail of blood down the hallway and into a back bedroom, the officer made a horrible discovery of 3 bodies piled together under a blanket. They were lying together in a heap, and the smell of gasoline was strong in that bedroom as well. The blanket covering the bodies had been soaked in gasoline, but nothing had caught on fire. The people under the blanket were already deceased. They included Rad, her husband Tony, and their small daughter Lisa. Looking further throughout the house, the officer discovered the 4th family member, the young son Danny, 4 years old, lying in his bed, deceased as well. All of the family members, each person, had been shot. Later investigation at the scene would uncover the evidence of what type of gun had been used to kill the family. Found on the floor were spent casings and bullets from a .22 caliber rifle. The police were not sure how long the family had been laying deceased in their own home, so they turned to a diary they had found in a bedroom belonging to Rad. Rad always faithfully recorded the events of the day, and the day of Wednesday, March 28th was no different. In her daily entry for March 28, 1984, Rad detailed the events of the day, which were somewhat mundane in nature, just normal activities of the family. But she mentioned a family friend named Tomo, who had come to the house to hang out. At the time of her entry, Rad wrote that her husband Tony and Tomo had been listening to the football game on the radio. Rad signed off on her entry in her diary in the usual manner, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary for that day, at least up until the point she wrote it. However, that was the very last entry in Rad's diary. March 28, 1984 was the very last day that she would record the events of her day. And at the young age of 21, her life was now over, and the lives of her children and her husband were over tragically as well. The next step in the investigation was to find the killer or the killers of the Young family, and the police started to canvass the neighborhood. The homeowners living next door reported that they had not heard any gunshots, and they had not heard anything odd either. However, they had seen something odd. Neighbors had seen a distinctive car that had arrived and left back and forth a couple of times into Rad and Tony's driveway after Wednesday, March 28th, after the last day Rad wrote in her diary. And since the police had reason to believe that a man named Tomo had been a visitor to the house on that Wednesday, March 28th, they obtained a photo of Tomo's car and showed it to the neighbors. Yes, they said, that was the car. They recognized it as the one that had been back and forth in the driveway. The reason that the police were able to quickly identify the man named Tomo and to get a photo of his car was because that name was a very familiar one to Rad's family, to the entire Milosevic family. And Tomo was a name that the family would soon regret ever learning. Tomo was a nickname for Alan Douglas Thompson, and he was a family friend of both Rad and Tony. He had been a longtime friend of Tony Baker. They had even played sports together when they were younger. But Tomo knew the Milosevic family even better. Now, at the age of 24 years old, he had been around the family since his teen years. He had grown up among all the children in the Milosevic family, including Rad and her sisters. We will return to how well Tomo knew the Milosevic daughters later in this story. For now, let's go back to Rad and her innocent, adorable family and how the police quickly wrapped up the case of their murder. Looking further at Rad's diary, the police learned that Tomo had been a visitor at their house often. He had ate meals there, played with their children, and just hung out. And when Rad's family found out that the police were investigating Tomo as a possible suspect in the murder of their daughter, her husband, and their grandchildren, they were shocked. Initially, through the first part of the investigation, and before the police had a chance to analyze any of the hard evidence, the family fully supported Tomo. They believed that he never could hurt his friends. He had always seemed like a nice guy, not capable of such an act as murder. But the police were going through this case step by step, and the first thing to do was to interview Thompson and ask if he owned a .22 caliber rifle. He admitted that he did, and he turned over the rifle to the police. The police took the rifle to be analyzed, and the ballistics confirmed it was the weapon used in the murder of Rad and her family. The bullets which fired out of the rifle and the bullets found at the murder scene were a match. Regarding the attempted arson at the house, evidence was also discovered that around the time of the murders, Thompson had purchased a jug of gasoline at an area gas station, and that empty jug had been found at the home of Rad and her family. When confronted by the police with the increasing evidence, Thompson initially denied any involvement. However, it was a short time later that he did make an admission. He said he had fired shots in the house, but he did not admit to shooting the victims with precision nor purpose. Thompson reported that sometime during the evening of Wednesday, March 28th, after he had been hanging out with the family, he had returned to his car to retrieve the rifle. He had gone back into the home and just started shooting randomly. He said that he didn't know what he was doing and he was just randomly firing shots throughout the house. The recreation of the crime scene would prove that Thompson had been deliberately aiming and shooting, not just randomly firing shots with no intended target. The crime scene recreation found these facts. The killer had first shot Rad, sitting with her daughter on her lap in the living room. The shot had killed Rad. And then the killer had shot Tony in the chest while he was sitting on another couch. Tony had then risen from the couch and fled into the hallway, where he was chased and shot again, and he died there. The killer had returned to the living room, where he killed Rad's daughter as she lay next to her mother. The killer had then dragged the three bodies down the hallway and brought them to the back bedroom. And at some point that evening, the killer also shot and killed the couple's young son, Danny, while he lay in bed. 4 innocent people killed for apparently no reason, and of course there could never be a reason for ever killing children. And that's why Thompson had nothing to say about the firing of his rifle. There was no motive. There was no reason. At least no reason that would make any sort of sense. And the trial of Alan Douglas Thompson made quick work of the case. Thompson had been charged with 4 counts of murder, although he pled not guilty. However, he was found guilty at trial, and Thompson was sentenced to 4 terms of life imprisonment to be served concurrently, all at the same time. Still, no motive was given for the murder. In newspaper articles around the time of the trial, both the Milosevic and the Thompson families were quoted as saying that they were just struck dumbfounded. They didn't understand why Rad and her family had been killed. Investigators thought, however, that Thompson had become attached to Rad. From reading Rad's diary, it seemed to the investigators that perhaps Thompson had become attracted to her and Rad had rebuffed his advances. And the reason why Thompson may have been emotionally attached to Rad brings us to the next part of this story. Because the first part of this story, the murder of a young couple and their 2 young children, should never have happened. Well, of course, it never should have happened at all, but it really could have been prevented. Because Thompson was already a killer, and he had gotten away with his first 2 murders. And those murders had taken place just over 2 years prior to the murder of Rad and her family. Alan Thompson had hung around with Rad and her sisters and their friends for years. He had known them since he was a teenager. He had been a good friend, like an older brother to all the girls. He had always hung out with them, offering to give them car rides and offering to teach them how to drive. And all that time together led Thompson and Rad's younger sister, Mariana Milosevic, to fall in love. Mariana was around 15 years old and Thompson was around 19 when they started dating. Fast forward to 2 years later and they were living together. Mariana was now 17 and Thompson was 21. The couple lived in New South Wales, not far from where the Milosevic family lived in the ACT. And that family home still included Mariana's younger sister, Lily, who was 14 years old at the time. At around 1 a.m. on Wednesday, December 30th, 1981, just hours before New Year's Eve, there was a tragic car crash that resulted in the death of 2 people. Earlier that day, Thompson and Mariana had picked up Mariana's younger sister, Lily, who intended to stay with the couple for the weekend. By the next morning, both sisters were dead. A news article about the car crash and their death had this headline: "Sisters burned to death in ACT road accident." The article started out with the following: Mariana Milosevic, 17, and Liliana, 14, were killed when the car ran off a highway. Police said that the car left the road, hit a tree, and burst into flames. The driver, Alan Douglas Thompson, 21, received minor injuries. Police are seeking the driver of another car which had passed Mr. Thompson on the highway to assist with inquiries into the accident. After the accident, Thompson's story to the police had been that he and Mariana had picked Lily up from Lily's mother's house at around 9:30 p.m. that evening. The 3 of them had then driven to a town in New South Wales. On the return from that town along a highway is when they had crashed in the hour after midnight. Thompson told the police that the high beams of an approaching car had caused him to veer off the road. He estimated that he was going about 40 to 45 miles per hour at the time. He said the car rolled down a grassy embankment toward a grove of trees. Unable to avoid a collision, the car had crashed head-on into one tree. Thompson said that after the impact, he had immediately climbed out of the driver's side of the car, went around to the front of the vehicle, where he noticed that flames were already coming from underneath the car. He then quickly went to the passenger side of the vehicle, trying to open the car doors to get the girls out. He said he had pulled and yanked on the doors, but that they would not open. And then, only a few seconds really after he had exited the vehicle and noticed the flames, the whole car had just burst into flames. And Thompson had received minor burn injuries to his arms and his face. But otherwise, he was perfectly fine, and his 2 passengers, his girlfriend and her sister, were both dead. But nobody really suspected that it was anything other than an accident. A horrible car crash, an accident that had taken the lives of 2 teen girls. Yet no one had been able to find the driver of the car that had supposedly blinded Thompson with the high beams. No one came forward. and there was no other witness to the crash. Even so, 2 months after the accident, the police in an inquest ruled that indeed the car crash was an accident, and the case was closed. Mariana and her sister Lily were both buried, and the Milosevic family tried to move on as best as they could with their own lives while still honoring and remembering their dear daughters and their dear sisters. And Thompson eventually came around to hang out with Rad, Mariana's sister, and Rad's young family. And supposedly, he had formed an attachment to her, an attachment to his deceased girlfriend's sister. After the murder of Rad and her family, and the trial of Thompson for that murder, the police decided to look back at that case of the car crash, to look back at that car accident that had taken place a couple of years earlier in 1981. Taking a look back at that accident, which had been thankfully well documented with lots of photographs and video, the police now found inconsistencies with Thompson's story that he had told the police back then. First, the damage to the car itself did not seem as if the car impacted the tree at the same speed that Thompson alleged it did. If it had, the car should have had much more damage. Thompson had said that he was driving 40 to 45 miles per hour when he had veered off the road. According to the car manufacturer, that could not have been the case. To the engineers and the investigators, it looked as if the car may have been going about 15 miles per hour when it impacted the tree. Investigators now believe that the accident could have been staged. And they only had one suspect who could have staged it, Alan Thompson. So the investigators decided to test out their theories by recreating the scene. They located the same model car and used a similar scene, a steep grassy hill embankment and a tree that matched the tree from the car accident. The original tree from the crash in 1981 had already been cut down. The police pushed and rolled the car down the hill at 15 miles per hour, and an investigator, wearing a helmet and pads, sat in the driver's side as it rolled down the hill and crashed head-on into the tree. And like Thompson's car from 1981, the recreation car had similar damage to it, all at the much lower impact speed of 15 miles per hour. Thompson's statement of hitting the tree at 45 miles per hour did not match the results of the crash recreation. Next, the investigators had to determine if the car had burst into flames on its own after the crash, or the fire had been deliberately set. Of course, they were suspicious now of this action because Thompson had used fire to try and cover up the murder of Rad and Rad's family. They wondered if he had done the same, and that time successfully, in 1981. Back in 1981, at the time of the car crash, the police had supposition that a metal spring in the engine had made contact with the car's battery, and that contact had caused an electricity arc, causing a spark, which then ignited the fire in the engine. If that was the truth, the investigators now wondered, then why was one of the headlights still illuminated, still glowing, as Thompson's car was being towed away on the tow truck on the scene at the car crash after the accident? That had been documented in the photos after the crash. In a closer look into the photographs taken at the time of the inside of the car, around the engine and the battery and the electrical wires, the police noted that there wasn't the fire damage that should have been there if the fire had started with the contact of a metal spring on the battery. In fact, the damage from the fire seemed to be located more on the inside of the car's cabin rather than in and around the car's motor. The engine itself looked less damaged than it should have been if Thompson's story and the cursory investigation of the police on the scene in 1981 were to be believed. Thompson had alleged that the fire had spread from the engine into the passenger compartment within seconds of the time that he had exited the vehicle. Looking back at the photos yet again, the investigators noticed splash marks from what they considered to be gasoline. Found both inside and outside of the car, the investigators noticed splash marks that indicated at least a few liters of gasoline had been spread all around the car. Back at the car crash recreation scene, the police decided to replicate the fire, and they used the same damaged vehicle that they had used in the crash recreation experiment. The result of that recreation and the ignition of an engine fire did not match what Thompson had reported had happened and what the police in 1981 had accepted as fact and a believable occurrence. In fact, it was only after lighting the fire in the engine and then dousing the entire front of the vehicle with a bunch of gasoline did the flames fully engulf the front of the car. And then those flames did not reach through the car's firewall and into the cabin of the car for at least another 5 minutes. And even then, the flames did not fully engulf the passenger portion of the car until an additional 10 to 15 minutes went by. Thompson's version of events did not match the recreation of the scene. Despite what you see in the movies, cars don't really catch fire immediately upon impact, and this one had not either. There should have been time for Thompson to get the passengers out of the car, whether they were injured or not. He should have been able to open the doors and drag them to safety. But there was more. Since the renewed investigation into the car accident that claimed the lives of the two Milosevic sisters, police went back to Thompson to go over his statement from the night of the car crash. Now his stories were not matching up, and that was a big red flag for the investigators. Initially, after the car crash, Thompson had told the investigators, the police reporting on the scene, that there had been an empty gasoline jug that he had been carrying in the trunk of his car. Now, upon the renewed questioning into the car accident, Thompson now told the police, 3 years after the crash, that in fact, that empty jug of gasoline was not in the trunk of his car, but it was a full gasoline jug, and that it was sitting in the floor of the passenger cabin. It was a full gasoline jug, he told the investigators, and he had intended to give it to his mother for her to use for her lawnmower, but that he had forgotten to give it to her. Therefore, he said, that full jug of gasoline had been sitting in the car, in the back seat, when the car had crashed. That gasoline jug must have been the reason the car caught on fire so quickly, he told the investigators. The jug must have fallen over in the car crash, and it helped quickly ignite the fire. The police asked Thompson, "Well, why did you lie about the gasoline jug and its location in the car after the accident? Why didn't you tell the police that?" "Well," he said, he didn't want to get in trouble at the time. He said he didn't want to be in trouble and at fault for carrying a full gasoline jug that had tipped over and contributed to the fire that killed his girlfriend and her sister. So now, 3 years later, Thompson was admitting that he had lied during the initial police inquest into the car accident. He had perjured himself, he admitted. But the police weren't buying this new admission. They now thought that Thompson had been lying about the whole entire thing. They thought he was lying about the accident. They thought everything about the car crash was just a lie. They now believed that perhaps the Milosevic girls had already been deceased before the car had crashed. And they again turned to the crime scene photographs for further investigation. Looking closely at the photos of the burned bodies of the Milosevic sisters, the police believed that holes in the girls' skulls, previously thought to have been damaged due to the fire, may have instead been entrance and exit wounds from a gunshot. But just examining those photos did not provide enough evidence. Unfortunately, they needed to exhume the bodies of Mariana and Lily Milosevic. The investigators were granted permission to do so, and they had a plan as to what they would be looking for. Along with the examination for possible gunshot wounds, they intended to examine the throat and larynx of each sister, in which, if their deaths had occurred the way that it had been determined in 1981, there should be evidence of burns and smoke inhalation. If both girls had been alive right before the car crash, and if the car had burst into flames only a few seconds after the crash, technically they still should have been breathing when the fire started. If there was no evidence of smoke or fire inhalation, they likely would have died already prior to the crash. And when the bodies were exhumed, much was learned. A bullet wound was found by X-ray in one of the sisters' skulls, the skull of Mariana. The examiner believed that the gun was fired at very close range to Mariana's head. The gunshot wound was consistent to have been fired from a .22 caliber rifle. A coat of lead was also found within the skull, supporting the fact that a bullet had passed through it. It was the same type of rifle that had been used in the murder of Rad and her family. The skull belonging to Lily had been too badly decomposed to establish any possible gunshot wound. It was so bad, in fact, that the pathologist could not be sure whether the girl had died of a broken skull from a head injury, or a rifle shot, or both. Additionally, the medical examiner found that there had been no burning in the larynx nor the internal organs. The lack of internal airway injuries now established that both girls had already been deceased prior to the start of the fire. And another note from the medical examiner read that he had found residues of a petroleum product, like gasoline, on the burned remnants of the clothing and the jewelry left on their bodies. So, if that was the case, the investigators asked themselves, if Thompson had indeed murdered his girlfriend and her sister, and then deliberately crashed his car and set it on fire to cover up that murder, what was his motive? Why had he done it? Well, all may not have been as it seemed in the relationship between Thompson and Mariana Milosevic. In fact, it was likely that Mariana wanted to leave Alan Thompson. It was revealed that prior to her death, Mariana had confided to her sister that she had become afraid of Alan Thompson. She had told friends from work that Thompson had begun to fight with her and that she did not want to be with him anymore. In fact, friends said, Lily had come to stay with Mariana and Thompson for the weekend because she wanted to support her sister in her effort to leave him. She wanted to support her older sister as she broke it off with her boyfriend. Mariana wanted to leave. Friends of the Milosevic sisters now believe that Thompson murdered Mariana that night because he found out that she wanted to break up. Some friends believe that Thompson convinced Mariana to go for a drive to talk about it, and Lily had begged to go along for the ride. Perhaps she had feared for the safety of her sister. Investigators believe that Thompson shot and killed both sisters, or shot one and injured the other in a manner to cause her death, and then he staged the car crash. And unfortunately, he had gotten away with it for 2 years until 1984. In 1985, 4 years after the death of the sisters, and 2 years after the death of Rad and her family, Thompson was found guilty after standing trial for the murders of Mariana and Lily Milosevic. The jury took little more than an hour to reach its verdict. And after the verdict was given, Thompson's defense asked the judge to give his client the benefit of the doubt and treat the murders of the two sisters as ones resulting from the passion of the moment. In fact, the defense had tried to have the 1984 murders not allowed into evidence at all during this second trial. Ultimately, it had been allowed since the facts of the two sets of murders in 1984 and in 1981 had been so similar that the judge ruled it would ultimately assist the jury in finding the verdict. In the court documents, the stated similarities were the following. 1. The family connection between each set of victims. 2. Each of the 6 victims involved in the 4 Richardson murders and those for which the accused is being tried was shot. 3. Each such victim was shot with a similar caliber rifle. 4. Each shot was through the head of the victim. 5. Each Richardson victim was shot at close quarters, and it was highly likely that the 2 victims of the present charges were also shot at close quarters. 6. In respect of the Richardson murders, the accused had attempted to destroy the evidence, and he had done likewise in relation to the present offenses. 7, the attempt to destroy evidence was in both instances by fire. 8, in both instances, the fire had been set by using gasoline. And number 9, the accused was present at the scene of each set of killings when or shortly before they occurred, and was the last person to see the victims alive. How sad it is that the very last person these Milosevic sisters saw while they were alive, the sisters being Rad, Mariana, and Lily, the very last person they saw was their old family friend, old Tomo. What a monster. What a piece of garbage. Alan Douglas Thompson was given a term of life imprisonment for each of the sisters' murders, to be served concurrently to the 4 life sentences he had already received. He now has a total of 6 life sentences. 4 years after the completion of that trial, in June of 1989, Thompson appealed to the Crown to dismiss his sentence, arguing that the evidence from the murder of Rad and her family should not have been admitted into the trial for the murder of the sisters. The defense argued that the admissibility of evidence of later killings should not have been included in the trial for earlier offenses. One point also laid out had been that the 2 sets of murders had taken place in different territories. The appeal was dismissed. At the end of the second trial, there was some discussion in the media about the mishandling of the car crash and the deaths of the sisters which had occurred in 1981. If the police had investigated the scene and the circumstances of that accident more thoroughly, it is very possible that Rad and her innocent young family might be alive today. Though the 1981 car crash was attended by a police doctor and investigators, it was readily accepted as an accident at the time. Some blamed it on the timing of the accident being over the Christmas holiday. Perhaps it wasn't as investigated as fully as it should have been. In short, it was admitted that it was a cursory investigation at the time, and later the incompetence and the mismanagement of the whole affair was noted. The traffic police bought the whole story told by Thompson of the oncoming car and how he had crashed. The traffic police had thus prepared the report for the coroner. The coroner who looked at the file had no obvious reason to go beyond the material gathered by the police. Another sticking point, which may have prevented a thorough investigation, although by no means should it be an excuse, was that the victims, the Milosevic sisters, had been so badly burned, to the point that initially their bodies could not be removed from the car. Any evidence of being beaten or any trauma to their bodies was not visible. And the wound, ultimately later determined to be from a gunshot, was initially thought of as just damage caused by the fire. Locals to the area will say that although Alan Thompson is serving 6 life sentences for murder, it might have been only 2 had the police and the doctors and the detectives done their job the first time. And they will say that if there was any sort of internal police investigation into what went wrong, or punishment for any neglect of duty, or search for lessons that might be avoided in the future, the public was not given that information. In prison now for about 38 years, Alan Douglas Thompson is over 60 years old. It is likely that he will never be released. Although, disturbingly, I did read at some point that he was incarcerated at a minimum security prison. I hope that is not the case currently. The investigators hope that he will never be released again into society. As I normally do when researching a case, I try to look for the photographs of the headstones of the victims. In this case, the headstones of both Mariana and Lily at the time of their deaths in 1981 had included the name of Alan. Their headstones had read that each sister had been loved by Alan. Since then, however, that name has been removed and scratched off from both of their headstones. In fact, if you look closely, all of Mariana and Lily's siblings' names had been included on their headstones, including their sister Rad. Also included among the names was that of their little nephew Danny, Rad's son. Never could the Milosevic family have imagined that in the very near future they would be mourning two of those names on the headstones of their daughters, that of Rad and Danny, and that their killer's name was among those that were inscribed. Rest in peace to Mariana, Lily, Rad, Tony, Danny, and Lisa. May their memories be a blessing to their friends and family. Thank you for your time in watching this video. I know that your time is valuable, and I am so glad that you chose to spend some of it watching this story with me. Let me know what you think about it in the comments below. And if you've made it all the way to the end of this video, you know I appreciate you even more. Thank you. If you would like to hear more true crime cases from me, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. But until next time, everyone, you know it. Please take care. It's rough out there. Everyone take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.